Father, as we take time out of our week to worship together and learn from your word, let us always remember that you are Jehovah Jireh. You are our provider, and your grace is sufficient for us. As we dive into your word today, I pray that we would hear from you and learn from you in ways that we haven't thought of before. Even when we look at passages, there's new things we can learn every time. Be with us this morning. In your name, amen. If I ask you to close your eyes and picture Jesus, what comes to mind? Does he have long flowing hair and billowy robes? Is he doing that weird head tilt thing like he does in the pictures? Or like in icons, moving his hands like he just touched something sticky? Or maybe he's doing finger guns? Does he have this ethereal quality? Does he seem to glow and just kind of float above the ground? If you had the same picture Bibles I did growing up, is he a little blonder and a little more pale than you expect a first century Middle Eastern Jewish man to be? Or do you see a guy you could hang out with, a guy that had dirty feet from traveling on the roads all day, a guy that understands what it's like to wade through the muck and mire of life because he does it right beside you? When we have this cutesy, angelic, ethereal image of Jesus, we miss what might be the central theme of the entire Bible, that is, God is with us. Jesus isn't floating above humanity, separated from our troubles. He's not some far-off king sending strangers into a fight. We have access to the divine because God is with us. God stands shoulder to shoulder as we try and make it through our day. Jesus knows about life on earth because he lived life on earth. Today, we're going to continue our study in Matthew 14 that Joey started last week. We're going to see Jesus standing with Peter in an unexpected place as we examine the time they walked on water together. The danger of covering a well-known passage like this is church folks who say, "Oh, I know that one." Jesus comes out, Peter's like, "I want to do that." And he's like, "Come on." And then Peter looks away and starts to sing, so always keep your eyes on Jesus. That's the gospel. Let's pray. When there's so much more that we should take away from the story, so we hope you'll keep an open mind as we investigate the story many of us have heard before. When I was in seminary, I had the opportunity to study under the late, great Howard Hendricks. At the time, he was in his early 80s, wearing an eye patch, and this was one of those guys that has forgotten more about the Bible than I think I could ever know. If he was going to do a sermon like this, his notes would be a Post-it note that say Matt 14, and he could talk for hours. And one thing he would drill into the head of every intro class was context, context, context is the cry of the exegete. And exegete just means someone who wants to study and interpret the scriptures. And the context of this passage is hugely important. To recap what Joey preached about last week, at the beginning of Matthew 14, Jesus learned that one of his very best friends, John the Baptist, had been killed. When Jesus heard this, he tried to get away, to be alone, to find time to grieve. When he did this, he wanted to be alone. This is a great snapshot of the humanity of Jesus. He lost his friend and wanted some time to himself, time to pray. And it's easy to think that someone like Jesus should be unfazed by a tragedy like this. He's Jesus. He knew it was going to happen. But as I'm sure you can ask the friends and family of anyone who's been terminally ill, knowing it's going to happen doesn't make it any easier when it finally does. Jesus was sad and just wanted to rest. Unfortunately, as he was trying to get away, the crowd found him. This crowd that either doesn't know or likely doesn't care that Jesus is going through some stuff, gathers around and asks him for help. The disciples try to get Jesus to send them away, but Jesus, even though he is going through his own pain, in a great snapshot of his divinity, shows compassion. He teaches them, he heals them, and he miraculously feeds thousands of them. And this is where we're going to pick up in Matthew 14, starting in verse 22. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had dismissed the crowd, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. The feeding of the 5,000 wasn't Jesus' first miracle, but it's probably one of his early, most public ones. And after feeding the crowd, Jesus sends the disciples away. Verse 22 says, he made the disciples get into the boat. The language here isn't as casual as we might read it. This isn't a, hey, you guys go on ahead and I'll catch up later. Jesus was telling them, you need to go now. Jesus knew that if he didn't break up this party soon, things would change. Jesus said he healed their sick, and fed their bellies. Those are two very real and very practical needs. If someone like that came along, you might want to keep them around by any means necessary to take care of those basic needs for you. In John's account of the story, he tells us that Jesus perceived the crowd might take him by force to make him king. But Jesus wants followers to follow him for who he is, not just for these things that he's done. If the crowd only followed him because he gave them bread, they would turn on him the first time he told them, man does not live on bread alone. Even knowing the fickleness of humanity, Jesus took the time to show kindness to the crowd that had nothing to give in return. The crowd just wants to take and take and take. And Jesus knew the importance of serving them, but he also knew the importance of finding peace in solitude. He wants nothing more than to get away with them. Still, he takes the time to show compassion and dismiss them. And when he finally left the crowd, he was able to find time alone to pray, time to commune with his Father in heaven, and time to seek comfort as he grieved the loss of his friend. As we know, grief comes in waves. Sometimes you want to be with people, sometimes you want to be alone, sometimes you want to do that weird thing where you're around people but you don't need to interact with them. And after taking this time alone, Jesus went out to be with his disciples. He wanted to be with them. He knew they might be in trouble because, as disciples do, they found themselves in a bit of a jam. Verse 24. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Jesus sent the disciples away before evening came, and it is now the fourth watch. This means that they've been at sea for a good 6 to 10 hours, and they were far from any shore. They were being thrown around by the waves. The word could literally be translated as they being tormented by the waves. You'd think as career fishermen, some of them would have a better grasp of life out on the water. In our modern lives, most of us think of fishing as a leisure activity. You go out with your buddy, drink a couple of sodas, you drop a line in the water, you float and relax, enjoy nature, and if you're lucky, you might catch a little something for dinner. However, life on the Sea of Galilee was terrifying. One commentary I read said that the sea was seen as a source of evil and chaos. It was known for its sudden storms. The water was your adversary. As a career fisherman, you took your life in your hands and fought the water for everything you got out of it. The last time we saw the disciples in trouble on the water was in Matthew 8. That time, Jesus was with them. He was sleeping in the bottom of the boat. And they wake him up and say, "Lord, save us," because they feared for their lives. And he calmed the seas. At this point in Matthew 14, they're probably not fearing for their lives, but they are exhausted. They've been rowing against the wind for hours, and it's only getting worse. And now they think they see a ghost coming across the water. Jesus sees the disciples reacting like they're the gang from Scooby-Doo and immediately speaks to calm their fears. "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Jesus didn't walk out there to spook anybody. He wasn't playing a prank on them. He was ready to be with his friends, and he knew that they would need his help, and he wanted to help them. This is a continued example of the compassion that we talked about last week. He tries to reassure them, telling them that they shouldn't be afraid. When he says, "It is I," he is revealing himself not just as Jesus, their friend and teacher, but as I am, as in the great I am from in the Old Testament that he would call Yahweh. For the Jewish audience Matthew was written for, this is an emphatic link between God the Father and God the Son. Jesus spoke comforting words to reassure them that their problems were not as big as they seemed because he was now with them. They should remember that Jesus calmed that storm in Matthew 8, and that situation was way worse than the one they were in now, and they should be relieved. The way God has provided for us in the past is a pattern and a promise for the way he's going to provide for us in the future. They were alone before, but Jesus, the person they've seen rebuke the wind in the past, is now with them. Everything's going to be okay, right? Jesus can just hop in the boat and they're off to the next destination, right? And then Peter starts talking. For a little context, Peter, you can think of Peter like the human embodiment of a young Labrador. You know, their dogs are generally nice, but they will smack you in the face and destroy everything on the table with their tail because they're so excited that you came back after, taking out the trash. Peter spoke and acted without thinking through the consequences. At times, this makes him one of the most relatable disciples in the gospel and shows us a believable example of how many of us would react when put in situations to see amazing signs and wonders or the stress of being in danger because of who our friends are. So let's meet Peter in verse 28. And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus, said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got in the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." We have no idea what made Peter ask this question. The disciples have been with Jesus for some time at this point, and they've seen him do other miracles, and we haven't ever seen them react this way. He's like, "God, I want to do that too." It's interesting to note that Peter's question, "If it is you," puts him in strange company for a disciple. There are 3 other times that someone says the words, "If it is you," to Jesus in Matthew. These are the devil in Matthew 4, when Jesus is being tempted in the wilderness, the high priest in Matthew 26, when Jesus is being interrogated during his trial, and finally in Matthew 27 by the mockers at the crucifixion saying, "If you are really the Son of God, then take yourself down." In each case, they are looking for Jesus to prove himself by doing something tangible or using his power for a selfish reason. Jesus knows that Peter is probably not asking for the right reasons. However, unlike those other times, Jesus grants Peter's request and calls him out upon the water. Walking on water ranks up there with healing the sick and raising the dead in terms of fundamentally altering how we understand the world working. It is a true miracle. Miracles, by definition, reject convention. And they can sometimes be a stumbling block for people who are investigating faith. In the 1700s, there was a philosophical idea movement that arose among the elites in Western Europe and some of the founding fathers of a nascent North America. And it seemed like a way for people to publicly maintain their belief in God, but also allow them to only hold to the parts that they liked. This was called deism. Deism sees God as a watchmaker. He puts all the gears and pulleys and levers into place. He sets things up, he winds it up, and then once it's running, he stepped away. This means that he set up the natural laws like gravity and what happens when someone steps out of a boat, but he's no longer involved in the day-to-day. Deism allowed people of the time to treat God as remote and disconnected from the world. If you wanted something to happen, it was up to you. There was no other help out there. The rules of the natural world were set, and as long as you worked within those rules, you could make it happen. The only way God may have helped you was by allowing you to be born into the right family, because clearly your power and authority was given by God. One deist you may have heard of was Thomas Jefferson, who famously cut and pasted his way through the Bible to assemble the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth, commonly referred to as the Jefferson Bible. Anything that was slightly supernatural, he removed it. For something like Jesus walking on water, a deist would outright reject it. At best, they might see it as some kind of metaphor or just try to explain it away like, well, there was probably a sandbar that no one could see. These were people that wanted to live in a world without faith. If something occurred, it could be rationally explained by the rules of nature that were already set in stone. Great things were done because you worked harder, because you were smarter, because you were better. And while I don't think there's a lot of people out there calling themselves deists today, I do think we have a lot of people that want to live without faith. I'm not talking about people outside the church. That's another conversation of how they interact with faith. Faith is something we struggle with inside the church. We put pressure on ourselves to be perfect, to appear perfect, to appear the most holy, to know more about the Bible than anyone else. And that's when it becomes the most dangerous. We want to know about Jesus, but we don't get to know Jesus personally. The scripture becomes a cold textbook of rules. We use it as, oh, this verse supports my political or social view. That's only used for the Bible I have. Jesus was just a good teacher that we should seek to emulate. Anything that appears to be miraculous just means we didn't understand it. It wasn't a miracle that Jesus walked on water. We just couldn't see how it happened. It wasn't a miracle that Jesus fed those people. He just inspired everyone to be generous. No. When we deny the miracles of Jesus, we diminish who he is. By rejecting his ability to restore sight to the blind, heal the sick, or feed the crowd, or walk on water, we reject his divinity. Jesus is special and important because he is fully God and fully man. He entered into the world to show us that the impossible was possible through him. If he's not fully God and fully man, then we have no need to believe in him. Peter had been traveling and working alongside Jesus for a few years now. He knew what Jesus could do. When he saw it was Jesus, he asked for a calling. He didn't know how it would turn out or the implication, and because it's Peter, he didn't think about next steps. He just saw what Jesus was doing and wanted to do it too. He sought a call, and Jesus gave it to him. It was an impossible request. Only Jesus could have called Peter to walk out on the water like he did. Jesus doesn't explain the calling to Peter, he just says, come. No description of how it's going to work or what it's going to feel like, just the simple word of direction, and Peter did the hard thing and listened. He took that first step and jumped out of the boat and stood with Jesus among the wind and the waves. If you want to see Jesus do great things in your life, you must make unconventional decisions. Peter hopped out of a boat in the middle of the sea. Jesus shows up when we take risks to get closer to him. Jesus shows up when we take risks to get closer to him. Have you felt that calling? What was it? How did it feel? Knowing that what you were doing was more than just happenstance, more than just going with the flow, more than just meeting the expectations of those around you. And this doesn't need to be, and this is how God called me to fix the whole entire world type call. It could be as simple as what you do for a living, how you raise your kids, or anything that is important to you. Maybe you felt God calling you to step out and join a bigger story. For Peter, Jesus called him to step towards him out of the boat. This first step is usually the hardest part. My boat is safe. I understand my boat. This boat keeps me out of the water that I don't want to go to. I'm not completely happy in my current circumstance, but I understand it, and being in control is more important than living into the life that is possible. Peter basically grew up on the water. He feared and respected the dangers of the Sea of Galilee. Still, he listened when Jesus asked him to leave that safety behind. So Peter walked out on the water to go to Jesus. That first step must have felt incredible. His body wouldn't know how to land. I have so many questions about those first steps. Like, was it super firm, like stepping onto a dock? Was it still moving? Like, was it like standing on top of a waterbed? When he's standing on the water, do his feet get wet? That's the kind of thing pastors stay up at night thinking about. What I do know is I hope you've experienced the joy of taking that first step of faith. That feeling where you know you are leaving safety behind, but it's okay because you are striding towards something greater. I don't know what boat you may be getting called to step out of, but each of us have something that we need to deal with so we can allow God to do great things in and through us. Sadly for Peter, the elation of being called to experience something so unique only lasted a moment. When he looked around and saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. And this is a common experience when we realize where our step of faith has taken us. We start to freak out. I personally took a big step of faith in February of 2017. I moved to New Jersey. My call to ministry is one of the things I am most sure about in my life. I had a professor once who told us that you know you're called to ministry because you can't do anything else. The draw to serve people in a way that brings them closer to God is too great, and nothing else can satisfy that need. And in 2017, that call brought me here. I liked what I saw of the church from afar. The brief conversations I had with Jeremy and the elders went well. I had that nervous but excited feeling that you get when you're starting out a new adventure. And after my first few weeks, I looked around and said, God, what have you done? Lord, save me. Don't get me wrong, church work was great. Restore was full of wonderful, hospitable, loving people. But I had gotten lost multiple times because apparently no one around here has heard of a straight road or like a grid. So like this road that goes this way and this road that goes that way meet somewhere instead of like veering off away from each other. There was a snowstorm and my car had been plowed in. And I live in apartments. I didn't own a shovel. And just all the other stress that comes with moving to a new place. Not to mention, the first 2 months of the year, not the best look for North Jersey. You know it's true. When we accept a call, we can get so focused on that one thing, that huge first step, that we forget to account for all the adjustments that might come with it. When we live into our calling, more than just one thing might change. I couldn't just work here, but keep my old life far away. I had to leave it behind. Peter reacted like one of those cartoon characters that has run off the cliff and is fine until he looked down and starts to fall. He was with Jesus. He had already done the hard part of standing out on the water, and still his faith faltered. As he began to sink, he did have the first right move. He called out, "Lord, save me." This is something Joey talked about at length last week. Who you really are comes out when you're put under pressure, when you get squeezed by life. Jesus just lost one of his close friends when he tried to get alone. The crowd found him and demanded his attention, and he showed them compassion. He finally gets away to have some time to pray, and when he gets back with the disciples, Peter demands his attention, and Jesus shows him compassion. Peter talks and acts without thinking, but he does the right thing when he starts to fall. When he gets scared and starts to sink, he reaches out to Jesus. Often when we find ourselves in trouble, our first reaction is to try and fix things ourselves. You got yourself into this mess, well, now you got to find your way out. And as I'm sure we've all experienced, sometimes that just makes things worse. When you feel overwhelmed by your calling, reach out to the one that gave it to you. Jesus gave Peter the call. Jesus knew that Peter would get scared and start to sink, and through all of it, Jesus was there to keep him safe. As you experience existence, as you go through the trials and tribulations, the good and bad days that make up life on earth, I hope your faith grows. But like a muscle, it won't grow without being tested. Some of the tests you bring on yourself, like when you make a bold choice to answer a call on your life. Other times the tests come from unexpected places, like when you lose a friend. Peter's faith, like your faith, is not a light switch. It's not an on or off relationship. Life and faith have ebbs and flows. Sometimes you feel stronger than ever. You're so close to God that you are untouchable. And other times you have to cling to that small ember of hope in the back of your soul that whispers, it's all good. I'm still right here, still listening. It's a constant process growing into the person you are to become. And even when it feels like the sun is setting in one place, it just means it's rising somewhere else. As Peter was afraid, he called out to Jesus. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And they got in the boat, and the wind ceased. Once Jesus got Peter safely back in the boat, he spoke to him about his little faith. Jesus used this phrase in a few other places in Matthew, and it's always directed at the disciples. These guys that had been working with Jesus and living with Jesus and seeing the numerous things he has done, at this point probably should have transcended from having like faith to just basic knowledge. Oh yeah, my friend Jesus, he does all this cool stuff. You don't have faith in your chair because you've already experienced it working. Jesus almost uses it as a loving rebuke. Come on, guys. We've been over this before. You know who I am. You know what I've done. You know that I love you. And there's an important contrast that I should point out. Peter stepping out of the boat to walk among the waves was a huge sign of faith. When he stepped out, he was saying, I know you are who you say you are. However, minutes later, he faltered. He lives in this balance between faith and doubt. Peter and Jesus were close. You'd think he would know the sound of his friend's voice. After all that Peter had seen Jesus do, you'd think, oh, walking on water, just add it to the pile. He can do that too. Peter, like us, knew what God had done in the past and still had a moment of fear. He doubted that Jesus would come through for him again. When we overlook what God has done for us in the past, we find ourselves having little faith. And Peter shows us the weakness of little faith. Little faith is too eager for signs. I think it's him, but I should probably put it to the test. I know God wants me to do this thing, but just to be sure, I need every light on my drive home to be green, and that's when I'll know for sure that it's a real calling. Little faith is apt to have too high an opinion of its own power. When he was standing out on the water, he focused too much on where he was and neglected to focus on the one who called him out there. Little faith is too affected by his surroundings. He was fine walking to Jesus and only started sinking when he saw the wind. And little faith is too quick to exaggerate the peril. The wind and waves were there before he jumped out. They didn't suddenly show up as he was walking to Jesus. Wherever you are in life, whatever your calling is, finding a reason to say no to a challenge is the easiest thing in the world. I know it's the right thing to do, but I know it's going to be difficult or scary, so I should just wait. Before we start bashing Peter too much, we need to remember that little faith has strengths as well. Sometimes you realize you've been running from your calling, you feel far from God, you feel like you've stayed in the boat too long. And in those times that you feel as though you are distanced from God, you can cling to your little spark of faith. Because little faith is true faith. Little faith is safe because Jesus is near. Sometimes all you can hold on to is the knowledge that you are not alone in the fight. Little faith obeys the words of Jesus. When Jesus told Peter to come, Peter didn't yell back, and then what? He just stepped out. And little faith struggles to come to Jesus. Your journey of faith often starts small. If you grew up in church or have been a Christian for a long time, it's easy to forget how the journey starts. You need to start with the smallest thing. I think this Jesus guy is who I think he is. Our hope is always that you continue to investigate and to grow, but little faith knows that it doesn't have the answers already. If it wants to know more, it has to investigate. It has to find the right questions to ask. Little faith will pray when it is in trouble, Lord, save me. And little faith accomplishes great things for a small time. The famous theologian and author Dallas Willard was asked in an interview, if a person wants to grow spiritually, what would your advice be? Where should they start? And he answered, do the next right thing that you know you ought to do. Lifelong Christians don't like this answer. Too often, Christians get lost in their own heads about how they want to serve and how best they prefer to use their ministry. We want to meander and pontificate. How does this match with that spiritual gift test I took? How do I make the biggest impact? How do I humbly let everyone know what I did? I better pray for the next 2 years before I do anything just to be sure that this is what I'm supposed to do. Big impacts are great. Praying before moving is great, but God called us to put our faith into action. James, in the book of James, tells us faith without works is dead. We need to be doing something. But new Christians, we love this answer because it takes a huge, complicated, nuanced question and answers it in terms that anyone could understand. I know someone that is cold, I can give them a coat. I know someone who is thirsty, I can give them some water. I know someone who is lonely, I can be their friend. If there's anyone in here wondering what the next right thing for you is, Restore is trying to build up a volunteer pool again. You can talk to Linda or email linda@restoreworship.org and get plugged in to put your faith into action. When you live out your faith, we get to see God work in amazing ways. Verse 32, and when they got in the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. As I mentioned earlier, this is actually the second time the disciples have seen Jesus calm the sea. However, the first time they reacted with fear and confusion, saying, who is this man that even the wind obeys him? This time, they worship. Even though they are still of little faith, they are beginning to recognize who Jesus is. In a couple chapters, Peter will be one of the first to confess that Jesus is the Messiah. Peter, with his excited puppy energy, the one who would speak and act without thinking, got to experience an exclusive miracle. Jesus unblinded a bunch of eyes. He raised a few people from the dead, and he healed a ton. But Peter was the only one that got to walk out on the water with him. In your life, I hope you've experienced a clear time when Jesus has come through for you, an exclusive thing for you. And as you think on those times, remember the way God has come through for you in the past is a pattern and a promise for what he's going to do in the future, even if he is too creative to do the same thing in the same way. Faith is hard. Finding or prioritizing your time with Jesus is hard. Just to finish out the chapter, verse 34. And when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. The time on the boat they had with Jesus was brief. They left one crowd of demanding people behind and found a new one when they reached the next shore. But in that small window, they were able to see amazing things. Peter walked on water, and Jesus calmed the wind. This was probably a keystone event in Peter's life. Sure, the disciples had seen a lot of amazing things, but in this moment, Peter got to experience the true power of Jesus. As you go about your life, you will gather experience. There will be successes and failures, times you answered the call, and times you shied away. I hope and pray that you have, at some point in your life, stepped out of the boat because you have felt a call so strong that you are ready to leave that safety behind. Sometimes this leads to lifelong change. You end up living in a new place, meeting new people, doing new things. Other times, you get back in your boat immediately. Either way, you can use that time as a keystone in your own faith journey of a time you saw God come through for you and you answered a call. And if you haven't experienced something like this, it's okay. You have plenty of time. God's love for you is new every day, and every day is another opportunity to say, here I am, Lord, send me. Faith is like the manna the Hebrew people ate when they were lost in the desert. It nourishes, but it doesn't keep. They couldn't store it up to save it for later. Each day they needed to gather more. As we have these mountaintop experiences, as we have these walking on water experiences of faith, we need to realize that we can't survive off those peaks alone. Each day, our faith needs to grow. It needs to be living and active. So as we grow more, learn more, risk more to get closer to Jesus. Give God a chance to come through for you, even if you feel like you only have a little faith. Let's pray. Father, having faith is hard. We can't touch it or see it. We can't store it in a jar until we are ready to use it. It is the muscle that we don't know how much it's grown until we put it to the test. As we grow, as we go about our lives, remind us that we can trust you, that you are a God that is with us. Remind us that you are there for us when we take the big step of faith, when we jump out of the boat, and even when we feel like we are starting to sink, you love us unconditionally. You are there to help us get back up again and again and again. Help us remember that our faith in you can always overcome our doubts. Amen.